Good afternoon, everyone. We will go ahead and get started. I think we should be recording, we should be going and everything. So, welcome to a Wednesday afternoon to a webinar that is hosted by ASHE CIHE, which is the Council for International Higher Education. I am happy to be here with everyone. My name is Christina Yao, and I'm currently the chair for CIHE. You can see a list of all of our executive committee who have this leadership role in our group. I'm going to get through some of the back end stuff real quick. We would encourage you to further engage with our community by joining as a member of ASHE and also selecting that you'd also like to be a member of CIHE. You get many other activities and benefits, including registration discounts. You get bi-monthly newsletters with a lot of information, networking and social events, and most importantly, access to webinars and connecting and networking with international education researchers globally. So you can do a quick little grab that QR code and you will be taken directly to the registration link. And on our next slide, I do want to bring up that we do have a few events that are coming up. One of our big ones will be on April 4th, which is the CIHE Networking Roundtable. You'll see a QR code right there, and that'll take you directly to the registration link. That'll take place between 11 a.m. and 1:30 p.m. Central Minneapolis time. So we have a lot of panelists, a lot of people who will be featured, sharing a lot of important information. So take a look at that, and hopefully you'll be able to join us. And then also make sure you put this one for sure in your calendar, is that on April 22nd, proposals are due for the conference and for the pre-conferences. That is at 4 p.m. Central Minneapolis time sharp. So make sure you put that in your calendar and get those submitted. Our conference and our pre-conference will take place November 20th through the 23rd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with our theme, which is I Am a Scholar. And I'm very excited to be there. And hopefully we'll see all of you. We usually, last year, we actually had it in the same location. We had a quick CIHE social the night before, and we will hopefully do that again with some bubble tea and snacks. So everybody loves, ending the night with some bubble tea. So here we are. This is why you're here, right? I am excited to present Dr. Stephanie Kim, who is the winner of the Best Book Award this past year. Really briefly, I'm going to read a quick introduction. It's a short one because if we read all of the accomplishments and all the amazing things that Dr. Kim does, we would be here all day. So Dr. Kim is a scholar, educator, author, and practitioner in higher education, a specialist in comparative and international higher education. She researches and writes about international students and higher education policy in the United States and countries in Asia. She's a faculty member at Georgetown University, where she is associate professor of the practice in the School of Continuing Studies and faculty director of the Master's in Higher Education Administration, as well as an affiliated faculty member of the School of Foreign Services Asian Studies program. Prior to arriving at Georgetown, she worked at UC Berkeley and received her PhD in education from UCLA. So I'm going to stop sharing here and I will pass it over to Dr. Kim.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Yao. Well, first of all, I just want to give a very humble thank you to ASHE and to the CIHE for recognizing my work. This is truly an honor, and I'm really appreciative of all of this and the opportunity to share with you my work this afternoon. So what I thought I would do today is present one chapter of the book that I think encapsulates some of the major contributions, but I will spend some time at the end to talk about the book as a whole briefly. So I'm just going to get started here with my screen. So I first wanted to start off my presentation with a story. In early 2020, this was right before the pandemic changed everything. I gave a talk at this organization called Graduate School USA, which is in Washington, D.C. So for those of you not familiar with this organization, it's actually not a graduate school, but a workforce training center for US government employees. And it started out as a government organization in 1921, but it branched off as an independent organization about 90 years later. But it still operates mostly with federal funding and grants, including the one that had paid me to give my talk at this organization. So my role there was to address the challenges that international students face when applying to college in the United States. And my audience was a group of high school guidance counselors. And each one of these guidance counselors was from a different international high school in South Korea. And they were all there as part of this US tour organized by Graduate School USA in order to learn more about the American higher education sector, so that when they returned to South Korea, they could better advise their students. And the whole thing was funded by a State Department grant, the point of the grant being to increase the number of students coming from South Korea to the US. And so here I was among this very eclectic group of individuals. The group included, of course, Graduate School USA employees who were like quasi-government employees. It included the high school guidance counselors from South Korea. It included US Embassy officials from Seoul who were there accompanying the whole group. And lastly, it included academics from local universities, such as me, who were there to give talks. And we were all there to talk about international students, even though there were no students actually in our group. And it really was this microcosm of all these different stakeholders who each play a part in international student mobility beyond the students themselves. And so this small moment actually led me to raise some questions about the role of all these different stakeholders. Because as higher education scholars, we often focus on the national level policies that governments implement to send or receive students, aka the macro level, or we focus on student level motivations that lead students to study in one country or another, aka the micro level. And occasionally we look at what happens when universities turn policy into practice, aka the meso level. And actually, this is where the book as a whole focuses on. But there's this really expansive ecosystem of all these ancillary people and organizations who funnel these students to specific universities, but who don't neatly sit within our macro, meso, and micro analyses. And oftentimes, they sit completely outside of that framework because all of these stakeholders, or many of these stakeholders anyway, don't have a formal relationship with any universities at all. So I started to ask some questions, including who are the stakeholders who shape student mobility flows between South Korea and the US? How can we identify the stakeholders within the global higher education industry? And I use the term industry here quite broadly to encompass those who are part of the for-profit education industry, such as education agents, for example, as well as other for-profit and non-for-profit actors. And lastly, what are the implications for how we understand international student mobility? Before I get started, I just wanted to give some context for understanding student mobility from South Korea to the US. And I'm sure many of you in attendance today already are aware of this, but South Korea is and has been the third largest sending country of international students to the American higher education sector consistently for the last 2 decades. And obviously, China and India send the most, but it's quite amazing that South Korea, which only has a population of around 50 million, trails right behind China and India, that, of course, each have a population of 1.3 billion. So when you adjust for population, South Korea actually sends about 3 times more students to the US than China does, and 6 times more students than India does, and which is why I focus on South Korean students as this kind of analytic category to ask these questions about student mobility. So even backing up even a little bit, I wanted to start off by discussing how higher education scholars frame international student mobility. And this will be a bit of a review for those of you on the webinar today. So of course, in 1995, the World Trade Organization declared education services a tradable commodity. And this set off a spectacular transformation across higher education sectors all over the world. And universities are now concerned with the buying and selling of their quote unquote services across national borders. And around the same time, of course, Sheila Slaughter and Larry Leslie coined the term academic capitalism to describe how higher education has become a private commodity to be bought and sold by the colleges and universities to AKA the providers to students and their parents, AKA the customers. And these ideas became the beginning of a very established methodological framework that higher ed scholars often adopt. So scholars such as Philip Altbach and Jane Knight argue that globalization is defined as the economic, political, and societal forces pushing 21st century higher ed toward greater international involvement. And internationalization is defined as the institutional response to globalization. And as universities respond to globalization in increasingly market-driven ways, scholars such as Nellie Stromquist further argue that internationalization is first and foremost concerned with a search for more students. And even when I was in graduate school about 10, almost 15 years ago, this framework for understanding the global higher ed system was considered foundational. And therefore, it really set the stage for how we even approach this topic methodologically. And so internationalization has widely been understood as this institutional response to global student markets. As these students pursue higher education overseas as part of participating in the global economy, scholars often argue that universities must respond to this new reality to attract these international students. In other words, the phenomenon of international student mobility is simply treated as the given context against which universities must adapt. And just thinking about how prevalent this understanding is, I mean, this is foundational literature that came from, roughly the mid-2000s. And while there have been some scholarly conversations since then, for the most part, this understanding is still used as a dominant methodological framework, which means that we really haven't significantly updated our understanding of international student mobility for almost 2 decades. But recently, I want to point out a couple of things. So scholars have started to talk about how universities should be more central in our understanding of international student mobility. And I want to introduce the concept of the flexible university, drawing from some literature in sociology and anthropology. So the concept of the flexible university subverts first and foremost the notion of flexible citizenship, which was first advanced in 1999 by the anthropologist Aiwa Ong. So flexible citizenship focuses on individuals who reposition their citizenship as a kind of proactive strategy to accumulate more wealth and power. And I think the most well-known work to apply that concept to international students is Vanessa Fong's 2011 book, Paradise Redefined. But Fong's book, as well as many others in the field, have often neglected to examine what actually happens in the universities where those students enroll. And so some scholars, including myself, have demanded that we prioritize the university more centrally in our understanding of international student mobility. And so we can move away from flexible citizenship and instead turn to the flexible university to illustrate just how flexible universities are in their reach and constitution. In other words, universities don't just respond to the economic, political, and societal forces called globalization. They are themselves exerting agency over this process. And they also do not just respond to international students. They are themselves creating the very pathways that allow students to be mobile in the first place. And I encourage you to actually look up the work of Yasmin Ortega, specifically her 2017 book, Immigration, Employability, and Higher Education in the Philippines, because Ortega's early theorizations on the flexible university were the starting point for my thinking in this direction. So the goal of my book as a whole is to offer a different methodology for how higher ed scholars understand international student mobility. The way international students are framed as a financial impetus by universities profoundly impacts their daily experiences on campus. And the interplay between the student recruitment logics and the international student experience highlights how students' lives are inseparable from the organizational behaviors of the universities where they enroll. And so this forces us as higher ed scholars to prioritize these infrastructural arrangements of higher education much more centrally in understanding international student mobility. And to do this, I draw from previous work on migration infrastructure. But taking the concept of migration infrastructure one step further and applying it to the flexible university, I'm arguing today in this talk and of course in the chapter in the book that we can't just focus on the university alone. We also have to examine all these diverse stakeholders who constitute this much broader industry of global higher education to fully understand international student mobility. So I wanted to do something a little bit different today. I thought a fun way um, to actually show this in action is to go through the actual admissions pathway that a South Korean student might take when they arrive at a university in the US, and specifically UC Berkeley, where I conducted a lot of research for my book. So, so forgive my very, simple, word art graphics. I'm not the most talented artist, but bear with me, please. So here we have a student. Let's call her Jessica. Jessica was born and raised in Seoul. She attended CIHE Girls High School, which is a private high school in Seoul. And she experienced what many South Korean students experience as they prepare to study abroad. She attended a cram school, a hagwon, and studied with a private tutor to become fluent in English. She practiced English conversation with a native speaker that was part of her exclusive high school curriculum. She did a lot of preparations to ready herself to enter a selective college or university. And UC Berkeley was actually Jessica's top choice. She believed that UC Berkeley would be an ideal place for her to study because it's in the San Francisco Bay Area, it's diverse, it's close to Silicon Valley, it has a very good reputation, and she knew she would thrive in such an environment. But there was one problem. So while Jessica had good grades, her test scores were relatively low. She had originally wanted to go to a university in South Korea and had originally put a lot of her energy preparing for the admissions cycles for attending college in South Korea, which is a bit of a different system. But in her senior year, she actually changed her mind and decided instead that she wanted to go abroad. But because she had been putting her energy into a different kind of admission system, she barely had time to prepare for the SATs and other kinds of admissions tests that would make her a competitive applicant for Berkeley. So what does Jessica do? How might she gain admission to Berkeley, which, by the way, now receives over 100,000 applications for freshman admission every year? Well, what Jessica ended up doing is employing the services of an education agent. And this is a pretty common practice in South Korea. Education agents are private individuals who work at for-profit agencies, and they're paid to provide consulting services to prospective students. A lot has already been written about their controversial for-profit status, and the main critique is that they don't have students' best interests in mind if they work within this profit-driven model. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A, but I first want to start with Jessica and continue on with her story. So Jessica consulted with an education agent to enhance her chances of getting in. And the agent gave Jessica some interesting advice. The agent actually recommended that Jessica first apply to a community college in California, which doesn't require test scores, get good grades there, and then transfer to UC Berkeley. So it's a win-win relationship. Jessica gets valuable admissions advice and assistance in preparing her applications, and the agent gets paid for their services. Now, what Jessica may not know is that the agent doesn't just provide services to prospective students, they also contract with colleges and universities, including a California community college that is well known for its high transfer rates into UC Berkeley. And for each student the agent refers to this community college, they receive 15% of first year tuition. The agent doesn't actually have a direct relationship with UC Berkeley because Berkeley has this explicit policy that they won't contract with these for-profit service providers. But the agent nonetheless advertises the possibility of attending Berkeley when they advise prospective students to apply to the community college where they do have a direct contract with. And at the same time, from the community college perspective, this community college manages multiple relationships with agencies across different countries, not just in South Korea, but all over Asia and elsewhere. And scholars such as Petulia Nukula and UC Kivisto have outlined why a college might want to partner with agencies. Agencies are more familiar with local market conditions and cultures. They can verify documents submitted by students, and they provide local networks that a college may lack. But it's not just the education agents that are part of this system. For many California community colleges, managing these contracts actually spans several levels, which are primarily organized around a community college district. So at the top, you have a district director of international recruitment who is physically based in California. And this person's job is to oversee a team of admissions recruiters who are physically based all around the world, often in the countries where they recruit from. So many times, mostly in Asia. And these admissions recruiters are hired on a month-to-month contract basis by the district. And their job is to act as the formal representative of the district as they live and work overseas. And so just like the agents, though, the recruiters, because they're on a contract basis, they can actually juggle multiple contracts at once with different colleges and universities. So, for example, a recruiter might represent a California community college one day at one event, and then a private university in New York another day at another event. And they also act as a liaison between the community college district that officially hires them and the agents with whom they set up contracts and act as that negotiating body. Now, I mentioned earlier that Jessica attended a private high school, and that high school actually has a pretty good reputation in South Korea, in large part because when their students graduate, they go on to very selective colleges and universities. And because the students who attend generally have some financial means, most of them seek out the services of an education agent rather than seek out the admissions advice of the guidance counselor who works for that high school. And the guidance counselor is fully aware of this. In fact, they don't even mind that students are seeking out agents over their advice. And they understand that if agents are helping students in the admissions process, then it benefits the reputation of the high school. And it also eases their own workload because they're first and foremost educators, not admissions professionals. So while it might look like Jessica's high school is the one that is sending the student to a number of selective colleges and universities, in reality, the high school tacitly relies on the work of agents to do this work for them. And because there are now so many stakeholders involved in the admissions process, so you have the agents, you have the admissions recruiters, you have the guidance counselors, and so forth, this complex regulatory environment has emerged. And it's really hard to establish ethical standards, especially within admissions at US colleges and universities. But of course, there are very good attempts to do so. And the most prominent organization to do this is, of course, NACAC, the National Association of College Admissions Counselors, which provides resources and guidance to its members. They set rules and regulations about working with agents. But even so, they ultimately have no enforcement capability because They're a professional organization, not a legal entity. And so they're a kind of quasi-regulatory body that presumably regulates agents, but can only softly influence colleges and universities, as well as high schools. Now, there is, however, a governmental body that does have legal authority over international students, and that is the State Department. And they approve student visas, set policies on international education exchange. And of course, the branch that oversees this most directly is Education USA, which is a diplomatic arm of the State Department. And their mission is to promote American higher education overseas. They often work in close coordination with the US Embassy in whatever country they're operating in. And ultimately, their goal is to increase the number of international students coming to the US. And while they don't directly govern these other stakeholders, they often facilitate the activities that would encourage a student like Jessica to attend a university like UC Berkeley and study in the US. And unlike these other stakeholders, the motivations are not necessarily about profit or prestige, but rather about geopolitics and advancing American interests. But of course, the State Department is just one governmental agency that regulates international students. And in the US, there are several agencies that also do this. Of course, there's the Commercial Service, which advances American commercial interests around the world. And so from their perspective, education is highly regarded as America's sixth largest service export. And so they see this as promoting and selling the American higher education, an American higher education to international students from an economic perspective. Another is Customs and Border Protection, which regulates travel to the US and seeks to preserve American national security interests. And similarly, the Department of Homeland Security regulates any kind of immigration or alien residence and also has a national security interest. And they do this under the auspices of, or through the auspices of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And usually these departments are typically aligned around international students, but at the onset of the pandemic, as we saw, there were widely different strategies. So of course, during this time, the Trump administration viewed international students as simultaneously financial assets to preserve and foreign invaders to fight off, what Christina Yao and Crystal Mwangi have written about. And that's what we saw throughout the pandemic. Education USA was actively encouraging international students to come to the US. The Commercial Service was advising colleges and universities on how to continue attracting international students. But the Customs and Border Protection was preventing students from coming through various executive orders. And the Department of Homeland Security and Immigration and Customs Enforcement specifically was deporting international students already here, also under executive orders. And so the point I'm trying to make with all of this is that when we talk about a student from South Korea coming to the US, the data often focuses on just this. This is what institutional data captures. This is what an Open Doors report captures. And so methodologically, this is what higher ed scholars primarily look at when we conduct our analyses. But by reframing how we even conceptualize international student mobility, by looking at the infrastructural arrangements of higher education, and not just within the university, but beyond it, we actually see that a pathway that a student takes is much more complex than meets the eye. And this has tremendous implications for what kind of methodological approach higher ed scholars should adopt when analyzing international student mobility. So returning to the big picture questions that I started out with, who are the stakeholders that shape student mobility flows between South Korea and the US? As I've discussed, the stakeholders include education agents, admissions recruiters, international high schools, quasi-regulatory bodies, and governmental agencies. These stakeholders coexist in a symbiotic ecosystem, often facilitated by monetary compensation. And they also become an extension of university student recruitment efforts within this much broader industry of global higher education. How can we identify the stakeholders within the global higher ed industry? Well, by doing what I just did, by mapping the admissions pathway that a student might take and identifying each of them, including ones that may not even have a formal relationship with the university, but are nonetheless part of their student recruitment efforts. And these stakeholders function alongside universities, even if they have very different motivations for doing what they do. What are the larger implications for international student mobility? Well, collectively, the stakeholders help ensure that the global student supply chain runs smoothly as they funnel students to one university or another. And in doing so, they transform students from customers to commodities that ultimately benefit the universities where they enroll. So in my book, Constructing Student Mobility, I argue that it's the universities, not necessarily the students, that create the very pathways that allow students their international student mobility. And I focus on two universities. I focus on UC Berkeley, and I focus on Yonsei University, which is in South Korea, both of which aggressively sought out international students after the global financial crisis. And these universities are geographically, culturally, linguistically miles apart, but they sought out students in these similarly flexible and market-driven ways that configured student flows around the world. And this book is also, a culmination of over a decade of research. I started this project when I was a doctoral student at UCLA, continued as a Fulbright scholar at Yonsei, a staff member at UC Berkeley, and now a faculty member at Georgetown. And I was really interested in contextualizing the international student experience within the organizational behaviors of the universities where they enrolled. And oftentimes my ethnographic analyses are complemented by firsthand insights of actually studying or working at these universities and being completely immersed in the day-to-day life of those campuses. So I'll just go over the 6 chapters of the book very briefly. Chapter 1 lays out the theoretical groundwork. So I question the concept of flexible university and instead introduce the concept of, question the concept of flexible citizenship and instead introduce the concept of the flexible university as a more useful framework for understanding international student mobility. And with that said, I also question how we frame international students as these exceptionally affluent and limitlessly mobile people if they primarily arrived because of the university's student recruitment efforts. Chapter 2 then hones in on UC Berkeley, where a sizable proportion of international students from South Korea are there. And I spent 4 years working at Berkeley as first as a postdoc and then a staff member. And I was also conducting an institutional ethnography of the university and looking at their student experience. And in this chapter, I show how the California higher education system reconfigured its community college transfer system into a kind of admissions pipeline for specifically South Korean students. And chapter 3 then hones in on Yonsei University, which is widely considered the most global university in South Korea, largely because it opened an international college there. And I spent a year affiliated with Yonsei as a Fulbright scholar and also conducted an institutional ethnography of this international college. And in the chapter, I show how Yonsei reconfigured this college into a kind of unusual admissions pipeline for South Korean students who might have otherwise studied in the US, but instead chose to study at Yonsei at this international college as a kind of domestic alternative to studying abroad. Chapter 4 then takes a deep dive into the actual students who entered either Berkeley or Yonsei through one of these novel admissions pipelines. And I focus on 4 students. These 4 students come from very different class backgrounds, and I problematize the concept of choice, specifically how international education is often framed as this privileged choice for privileged individuals when their choice to study abroad was really the result of a specific pathway created by the university that intentionally brought them there in the first place. Chapter 5 is what I just presented today. It's also the most experimental chapter of the book, and probably one that I'm most excited to put out there in the world and share. So, of course, I examined these ancillary people and organizations that make up this much larger industry of global higher education. And I provide a structural analysis accompanied by ethnographic vignettes of different parts of this industry and map how they all fit together. And ultimately, I show how universities are just one node within this expansive industry that shapes the global student supply chain. And lastly, chapter 6 was probably the hardest chapter to write because it tries to make sense of this turbulent decade that is sandwiched between the global financial crisis of the late 2000s and the very beginning of the pandemic. And within the 2010s, essentially, international students increased rapidly in numbers in the US, but and elsewhere, not just in the US, in South Korea and elsewhere. And public sentiment turned against them. And I also reflect on the future of international student mobility beyond COVID, which is something I'm happy to talk about more during the Q&A, but also what was what was at the time the hardest chapter to write. Last but not least, I also want to just give a brief shout out to Minji Son, who is a performance artist from South Korea. She allowed me to use one of her works for the cover image for the book. So the photo that's on the cover is from her series Turn Right, Turn Left. And this reflects the artist's life moving from country to country since the age of 11 as an international student. And to me, the photo evokes a sense of constant movement, yet restriction in how one can move. And I connected with the artist when she gave a talk at Berkeley, and she was gracious enough to allow me to use her photo for the cover. So definitely check out her work on her Instagram page. The book was published last year with the MIT Press. You can order a print copy directly from the publisher or from any number of vendors, or you can also access an electronic version via open access, and that might be useful as an addition to your syllabus and other teaching materials. So I'll stop sharing here and happy to jump into a conversation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Kim. I'll give you a chance to rehydrate for a minute. I do recommend picking up the book. I will confess that I pre-ordered this book and I haven't had a chance didn't get a chance to read it until this webinar. So this is, and actually before everybody showed up, I popped on and I said, I was like, Stephanie, this book is really good. Like, it's interesting, it's personal, it brings in a very interesting and important perspective about international student mobility and everything. So thank you for your 10 years of work on this. And I what I love about what you talked about also, and I think there's for a lot of the grad students who might be on here, is that your dissertation work can help inform things that you continue to do throughout the years and everything. So this is a great example of that. So, all right, I'm going to jump into some questions and stop talking. So one question, well, it's a comment and then a question. So in my experience in Mumbai, in India, the Education USA office also only typically works with top private institution students or students deemed good for the Fulbright application instead of the widespread diverse local community. I think this further decreases the real access an Education USA office set out to provide, but instead becomes similar to the local private agents. So the question is, do you have any thoughts about how Education USA offices function in your book's context or elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, that's a great point to make and a great question. Talking a little bit about the specific context of South Korea and the Education USA office there, the people who work in the office, certainly the people I've spoken to, are well aware that they serve a relatively small slice of all the students who would be US bound from South Korea. And you know, even some of them have directly told me if we helped all 50,000 students coming from South Korea to the US, their office would be overwhelmed. They simply just don't have the capacity for that. But they also recognize that all the different actors, education agents included, are all working toward the same goal, which is to increase the number of students who go to the US. And so, in many ways, these offices work in tandem or sometimes in direct partnership with them, depending on the office and the context. So, for the office in South Korea, I think they're a little bit skittish about directly working with the agents, but they nonetheless recognize that agents are doing similar and good work that aligns with their interests. And so, in many ways, they tacitly understand that and work in very loose ways together. It might be different in other country contexts where there are much more direct relationships, maybe even workshops and events that they hold together. So certainly they don't see, certainly the Education USA officers don't necessarily see education agents as this, antagonistic population, but a partner that works in the same way.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. And as a reminder to the audience, before I get into the next question, feel free to pop in your questions or comments in the chat or also in the Q&A. So, all right. Next question is, what are the disadvantages of international students not going through an education agency?
So again, I'm going to make it very specific to the South Korean context. And part of the reason why the use of education agents is so prevalent is because it's through a word of mouth network that one student sees their classmate using a particular agent to have an advantage. And so they feel like they need to do it as well. And not only that, but they also tend to go to the same education agent or the same agency that their classmate did to find in order to get the same advantages. And so even though it's a pretty broad industry, it's quite segmented in that 10% of the agencies actually have about 90% of market share in South Korea because of this really strong word of mouth network. And so, what are the advantages and disadvantages? It's more perceived as opposed to something we can measure absolutely, but the perception is anyway that if you're not using them, you are falling behind. Also given that the strong word of mouth networking there, that's really the only way I was able to even have access to talking to agents. I really had to go through some of my personal networks. If someone who knew a family member who had used an agent, I really had to get in that way because it's really hard to access this network without being introduced and being in that word of mouth network. And there was a lot of difficulty, of course, when the pandemic happened and I wasn't physically there. And so that's a sort of, back end story of how the book was made.
I think the concept of educational agents is also interesting, is that we talk a lot about it in international education and a lot about with international students. And to a certain extent, we see it as a problem. I think broadly, we like, oh, that's kind of a problem. They're buying into this, whatever, but I think it's also similar with US students who use what we call college consultants, right? Which happens all the time. It's the SAT prep, let's talk through this, what you should do and all of that. So yeah, some interesting perspectives too, I think. All right, next question is, I've been greatly interested in the concept of reputation and legacy of institutions in South Korea and how the path of your life can be changed depending on where you attend for a university. How much do the concepts of brand, reputation, and institutional legacy play into the decision-making and cultural understandings of universities' mission that you observed in your research with South Korean students?
Oh, so the short answer to this question is a lot. Absolutely, it does make a difference and a huge difference. So the students whom I've been talking to, interviewing, just simply learning from, they have shared with me that, of course, what college you attend in South Korea really does set up a student for a certain socioeconomic path beyond that in a much more rigid way than we would find in, say, the United States because of these tightly knit alumni networks that often usher the graduates into these coveted jobs. And in a place where youth unemployment rate is exceptionally high, these networks become even more important to at least help secure a student's middle class status. So it may not necessarily propel a student into prosperity, but it will at least have some kind of buffer or insurance against extreme poverty. So, so a lot of the students they know this from a very early age, and so there's this idea that if they don't get into a certain band of colleges or universities, then at least their prospects within South Korea are much more limited. And this is where places like US colleges and universities might be more attractive as this kind of alternative to this very rigid system in South Korea. Of course, getting into a competitive college or university in the US is not necessarily easier, but there are more diverse pathways to do that, including, for example, community colleges, which are much more accessible and also allow the ability to transfer into a four-year university like in California. So, so part of all of this is that these novel admissions pathways, for example, the community college transfer pipeline, or even, for example, this international college in South Korea that would usher students into Yonsei, which is one of the more selective universities, these became alternatives to the much more rigid pipelines of admissions that a student might normally encounter.
Great. All right. I will read you the next question. Um, Thank you so much for your talk in the book, exclamation point. So I'm going to add that in. Given that commercialization of internationalization of higher education is so multifaceted and layered, if we were to work toward more equitable internationalization of higher education and student mobility, where should we even begin based on the insights gained from your book?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I to be perfectly honest, I don't have a great answer to it. I think it's a work in progress. I think that certainly um, you know, one way to start is to reframe how we even think about international students, because oftentimes international students are equated as sources of revenue generation for wherever they enroll. And of course, by the college or university, and then of course, by all these different stakeholders who operate in tandem with them, who also profit from them in various ways. So to make it more equitable, the first is to reframe even why international students are wanted in the first place. And it doesn't mean that they can't generate revenue from them, but that shouldn't necessarily be the first priority. So I think that's a starting point. What that actually looks like in practice, I think it's an evolving concept.
Great. Again, if you all have questions, please pop them in the chat or put them in the Q&A. Until then, I'm going to ask one of my questions, which, when I was going through your book and listening to your presentation and everything, is that it seems that when we think about international student mobility, particularly in this case, is that there's a high emphasis on the community college pathway. And my guess is that that's also a big part of in other states as well in the United States. But I don't feel like there's a lot of emphasis on that, right? More generally, I think you talk about it in your book. I know Dr. Rosalind Raby is on this, who's done a lot of research into this and everything too. But there just isn't a lot of emphasis on on the role of community colleges when we're talking more broadly about international students. Do you have any insights on that, or do you have suggestions on path forward?
Yeah, it is interesting because certainly when we look at California, a lot of the even media attention has been focused on the UC system specifically. And at least throughout the 2010s, there was this rhetoric that, quote, international students are taking our seats, right? Like we would see this in the headlines. It was a zero sums framing, but it never quite reached the community colleges or even the Cal State system. It was always about the UC specifically. And so, for and it seems to be an overlooked population within the community college system. But in some of these community colleges that I was looking at, when you look at the transfer rates of those who transfer into a place like Berkeley, international students sometimes meet a third of those transfer populations, and in some years almost half when you look at some of the years in the height of that period. So yeah, it's overlooked. I think more attention needs to be placed on it. I'm glad people like Rosalind Raby and many others, Melissa Lotley and so forth, are looking at this population more closely.
Yep, for sure. I think one thing I saw in your book, one thing when we're talking about with the agents is that one thing you said is UC Berkeley has an explicit policy of not partnering with agencies, but many of California's community colleges have no such policy and do indeed partner with them. And so that brings in a whole additional layer and everything too. So, all right. I got my one question in, so we have another question in the chat. And that is, what are your thoughts on the reputational capital gained in the US universities as a way to gain access to the Korean academic system? What are your thoughts on the reputational capital that is gained in the US universities as a way to gain access to the Korean academic system? And how do these pipelines work to enable that? Oh, like faculty positions in the Korean academic system. So how does the reputational capital gained in US universities, how does that help as a way to gain access to faculty positions in the Korean academic system? So probably more graduate students.
I see. Okay, got it. Yeah, so for the book, just to clarify, I focused on undergraduate students, specifically because undergraduate students were seen as a source of revenue generation. But graduate students coming from South Korea to the US or from many other countries to the US have been happening. This has been happening for a much longer period that predates the influx of undergraduate students. For those who come to the US from South Korea as graduate students, it really is a way of positioning themselves for faculty positions or other high-skilled professions within South Korea. There is or at least there was anyway, it's evolving, this idea that you do your undergraduate education in South Korea, build your college network through that network, then your graduate degree in the United States, which gives you that positional capital so that when you return to South Korea in, say, a faculty role, if someone goes into academia, that gives them a much stronger advantage of attaining a highly coveted faculty job. So that was when you actually look at some of these very selective universities in South Korea, and you look at all the faculty bios, you'll see actually that the vast majority have received their graduate degree in the United States, and oftentimes their undergraduate degree from the very college that they work for because of these alumni networks, again, that reinforce themselves.
All right. Not a question, but a comment. So our friend Rosalind says, Stephanie, you showed so clearly and deeply that the relationship between community colleges and universities are complex and can serve the needs of international students. I loved your book. So wanted to share that so everybody in the audience can hear and you can hear that too. So maybe I think we have 5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask this one final question, unless there is a question out in the audience. So if you do, feel free to pop it in there. In our conversation, you said you wrote a final draft fall 2021, went back in, cleaned stuff up, added a few things and everything. But as we know, things are constantly changing, right? Like I feel like month by month, there's something new going on. What are some of the things that, like, what's next, right? If you were to rewrite this book at this moment, what are things that you would add, or what are things that you think are changing, or if you could see into the future, what would be an extra chapter that you would put in there?
Yeah, like I said, the last chapter of the book, chapter 6, was the hardest to write. It was the last chapter I wrote. I was writing it at the height of the pandemic with 2020, 2021. And part of that is because everything was changing so fast. When I first started out writing the book, I didn't anticipate that the pandemic would happen. I mean, nobody did. And then of course there are so many different policy changes, both at the both federal policies as well as state level policies in California. Um, so many things in the higher ed landscape have changed. Test blind, test optional has become much more common since the pandemic. What I think has really changed the most rapidly in terms of international students is that colleges and universities are rethinking who international students even are, because they have seen these huge fluctuations in enrollment because there was so much disruption. So, um, typically the international student was seen as someone young and mobile, someone who can pick up from their home country, move to the United States to come to school or any other country to come to school. I think post-COVID, we've seen that, of course, virtual learning environments have become much more accepted. There's a bit of a stigma before COVID, but I think that stigma is largely dissipated. And because of the prevalence of virtual learning, colleges are rethinking whether international students even have to be young and mobile. Maybe they can be a bit older and more settled. So they're starting to look at adult student learners, um, those who may not necessarily be able to pick up and leave their home countries, but it doesn't matter with virtual delivery options. And I think this is a direction that I think increasingly we're seeing more international student recruitment moving toward. And even a recognition of this when we look at some of the Open Doors reports who that now actually count this population as international students when previously they didn't.
I think that's a really great point. And I think even in your book, you mentioned, right, that there's a concern in South Korea that there's like the youth population has been shrinking and everything too, right? So even the number of students who will go to college, whether in South Korea or as international students in other countries, is going to look very different. And I think we've seen some of the changes in the recruitment strategies and recruitment areas and regions and everything, even within the past year or so too. So all right. If there are no other last minute questions from the audience? Oh, there's one that popped up. Okay. Oh, I was wondering if you sense some level of awareness among students about their relative privilege regarding their access to U.S. higher education system. Do you have a quick answer for that one? If they had an awareness about their relative privilege regarding their access to U.S. higher education.
Yes, I have an answer. It's not going to be a quick answer because it's a very big question. Um, because we have only about a minute left, I'm going to try to uh, compact the answer a bit. So the short answer is yes, absolutely. The rhetoric that we hear about international students, quote unquote, those rich international students, of course, students are aware of that. And not only do they encounter that, you actually see within international student populations some internalization of that. And even within Korean student populations, not only is there internalization, but there's very complex othering within that student population. So then you have, for example, some Korean students call other Korean students those rich international students, even though they might all be international students themselves. I delve into that a bit more in a nuanced way in a couple chapters in the book. So I'll just refer you to there to read specifically chapters 2 and 3, which really dive into that phenomenon and how they position themselves and understand their privilege.
Great. All right. Dr. Kim, thank you so much for spending some time with us. This was really valuable information, some great work, and congratulations again on winning Best Book for the 2023 CIHE contributions to international research. So thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for being here. Take care. Don't forget
Thank
to
you.
register for all of our other stuff. We got a lot of other stuff coming up. Take care, y'all. Bye.